Imagine a handful of ragged adventurers, men with no land, no future, and no name, crossing an ocean in leaky ships. Within a few decades, they would topple empires of millions, plunder unimaginable treasures, and redraw the map of the world. These were the conquistadors. To some, they were heroes of discovery. To others, they were ruthless killers who left whole civilizations in ruins. But how did a few thousand Spaniards manage to conquer 2 continents? And what did they leave behind? Beyond the gold, the cities, and the myths. Today, we'll dive into the real story of the conquistadors, their rise, their cruelty, and the legends they carved into history. Who were the conquistadors? In short, they were all kinds of people. Rootless criminals, impoverished nobles, men who ventured into the unknown in hopes of becoming rich. Some could be called explorers, others ruthless killers who wiped out entire tribes. Today we'll try to figure out where the legend of the fabulously wealthy city of El Dorado came from. Did it actually exist? Was it ever found? But let's go step by step. The word conquista translates from Spanish as conquest, and it's tied to another crucial period in Spain's history. The Reconquista, meaning reconquest or liberation. In brief, the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century, just before the Age of Exploration. For centuries, nearly all of Spain and much of Portugal had been under Muslim rule. Catholic kings fought to drive the Moors out. That was the Reconquista. The tide turned in 1469, when Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon, uniting the 2 most powerful kingdoms on the peninsula. We'll make a separate episode about that for sure. Under their rule, Spanish armies steadily pushed the Muslims southward until finally, in 1492, they took the last stronghold, Granada. The crusade was over, but the soldiers remained. These knights and mercenaries, men who lived by looting, raiding, and warfare, needed a new purpose. Otherwise, having so many armed men idle in the kingdom risked a social explosion. But where to send them? Not to Catholic France or Portugal, where there was little to plunder. Another problem after the Reconquista was the lack of land. Spain was poor in farmland. Much of the interior was almost desert. A new social class emerged: the landless hidalgos, younger sons of nobles who inherited nothing. The eldest got the castles, estates, and titles, while the younger ones had no choice but to join the military. These men would later form the backbone of the conquistadors. Isabella and Ferdinand considered different routes for expansion. They tried North Africa, but Arab resistance blocked them after a few coastal cities and fortresses. West Africa was tightly under Portuguese control. Since 1461, Portugal had enforced strict secrecy around its routes to prevent anyone from reaching India or discovering new lands. And then came a Genoese sailor, Christopher Columbus. He had a bold idea: to find a westward route to India. Living in Portugal and having visited England, he had heard of lands lying to the west. Portugal's main interest in India wasn't gold, but something more valuable: spices, especially pepper. These were brought from the Moluccas through Malaysia, India, and Egypt. Then overland to the Mediterranean. Pirates and rulers taxed every stage of the route, making it expensive, but still wildly profitable. A measure of pepper that cost 1 ducat in Asia sold for 40 in Europe. Columbus was convinced a shorter, safer, and cheaper route could be found by sailing west. He went to Spain and spent 5 years begging Ferdinand and Isabella for funding, but they always refused. No money, we're at war with the Moors. Only after Granada was taken did they finally back his plan. Funding came partly from the royal treasury, which had just been replenished with the confiscated wealth of expelled Jews. A policy overseen by Grand Inquisitor Torquemada, Isabella's close advisor. 3 August 1492, 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, sailed from the Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera. That's the start of the Age of Discovery and the conquest of the Americas. an era that would make Spain the richest, most powerful empire on the planet. On his first voyage, Columbus reached the Bahamas, San Salvador, then Cuba, and finally the large island he named Hispaniola. And whom did they find? The Arawaks, the local inhabitants. Believing he'd opened a westward route to Asia, Columbus mistakenly labeled the lands the West Indies and the people Indians. They were, of course, nothing like the crude stereotype. On the islands, the newcomers encountered tobacco and, most importantly, staggering quantities of gold stored on Hispaniola, the name Columbus gave to the whole island, today divided into Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, in the colony of La Navidad, came the first clash with locals. The Spaniards behaved brazenly. They plundered, seized gold, took women, and forced themselves on them. The islanders struck back, stormed the fort, and killed 39 men. The expedition returned to Spain. Sensational news. New territories, gold, tobacco, female captives. On the second voyage, 17 ships under Columbus formed the core of Spain's Caribbean force, and for the first time a missionary priest joined. Important aside, beyond colonizing new lands, the line was, they all must be baptized, they're barbarians. But that pious cover masked a simple aim. The church wanted land and influence on vast new territories. Hispaniola was chosen as the colonial center. The governor's residence was placed there. Expedition leaders received a new crown title, Adelantado, Pathfinder, granted to those not yet called Conquistadors at the time, officially commissioned to explore and subdue new lands. Crucially, it set you apart from an independent adventurer or pirate. Francisco Pizarro would later hold such a commission in Peru, though not every explorer, Magellan for example, was given this title. Then, in 1498, a turning point. Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama opened the sea route east to the real India, proving Columbus's lands were an entirely different world. That news turbocharged exploration. In 1502, Columbus reached the Central American coast near Panama. Meanwhile, Ferdinand and Isabella appointed a new governor of Hispaniola. He arrived with 30 ships and 2,500 settlers, expanded the crown's holdings, and launched brutal campaigns against indigenous people in Haiti, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. The arithmetic was pitiless. When the Spanish landed on Hispaniola, the native population was about 500,000. Within 15 years, only 60,000 remained, killed, driven into backbreaking plantation labor, and ravaged by old-world diseases. Contemporary accounts paint the Spaniards as monsters. As punishment, they cut off limbs and sent victims home like that, split people in two on a dare, or took a head with a single blow. Terror as policy, meant to paralyze resistance. But cruelty on that scale isn't just strategy. It's pathology. And yes, see our episodes on serial killers. These Spaniards handed absolute power over a defenseless population, looted, brutalized, and assaulted them. The Spanish established an institution called the Encomienda, literally protection. What did that mean in practice? In theory, indigenous people would pay tribute and perform labor, for example, in the mines. Colonists, in turn, were supposed to take on obligations to convert the locals to Christianity and introduce them to European culture. But very quickly, across almost all colonies, this protection degenerated into outright slavery. And here, as always, the Europeans excelled at spin. Imagine paying a tax so you could be taught European culture and religion you never asked for. In reality, you were robbed, violated, and forced to till the land for someone else's benefit. What came next? Spaniards pushed further along the coasts of North and South America, approaching from the Atlantic. Few dared to venture inland. An exception was Vasco Núñez de Balboa. He founded the first Spanish city on the American mainland and was the first European to cross the Isthmus of Panama, reaching the Pacific. His force of 190 men included a future legend of this story, Francisco Pizarro. Balboa wrote to the king that he had discovered the fabled land of El Dorado. You've heard the name, no doubt. the mythical South American city overflowing with gold and jewels. Expeditions went out chasing that legend, driving major discoveries, but the city itself was never found. While expeditions crept along the mainland coast, the islands also drew attention. Cuba was conquered as brutally as Haiti. One participant recalled, "Blood flowed like rivers, as if an entire herd of cattle had been slaughtered." The conquerors quickly settled in, founding the capital Santiago de Cuba, and there, the star of 25-year-old Hernán Cortés began to rise. From a noble but impoverished Spanish family, he first served as aide to the governor and later as commander of the capital. Meanwhile, Spain itself was changing. In 1516, King Ferdinand died, and the throne passed to his grandson Charles. We've covered the Habsburgs in a separate video on our channel. 3 years later, Charles became Holy Roman Emperor, a title that required immense funds to secure, money he aimed to recoup by exploiting, i.e. plundering, overseas lands. Europeans grasped the true wealth of the Americas almost by accident. Cortés sent Charles a gift of stunning Aztec artifacts. The emperor was so dazzled he carried them everywhere. German artist Albrecht Dürer described them. "I saw things from this new land of gold, the sun of pure gold, the moon of pure silver, all manner of weapons, armor, wondrous shields, garments. I rejoiced and marveled at the subtle artistry of people from distant lands." By 1517, Spaniards had landed on the Yucatan coast, meeting the Maya for the first time. More expeditions were inevitable. The most important was led by Hernán Cortés himself, remembered as Spain's greatest campaign of conquest in the Americas. He left Cuba on the 18th of February 1519 with 11 ships. Early in the expedition, a seemingly minor event would prove decisive. In one village, the locals gave him gifts, gold, and 20 young women. Among them was Malinche, a noblewoman. Baptized and renamed Doña Marina, she became Cortés's translator, confidant, and intermediary with the Aztecs. In Mexico, the Spaniards immediately encountered the harsh religion of the Aztecs, who offered human sacrifices to their gods. Cortés launched a furious campaign against paganism, tearing down temples, smashing idols, planting Christian symbols. Yet in the beginning, the very religiosity of the people worked in the Spaniards' favor. The Aztecs mistook them for divine beings, since the Spaniards were bearded and light-skinned like the god Quetzalcoatl. But soon news of their landing and their behavior reached the Aztec emperor, Moctezuma. The messenger reported true wonders to him: horses that looked like deer, so tall they reached the rooftops, dogs with fiery yellow eyes, and the thunder of artillery that could easily smash through the walls of houses. The emperor fell silent in horror, and then asked, "What will become of us?" It was then that Montezuma sent Cortés those very gifts that later made their way to Spain and impressed Dürer. Here a small digression. In many Spanish chronicles and accounts, they wrote, "What a nightmare, what horror! These pagans sacrifice people to their gods, sacrifice infants, drown virgins in lakes. Terrible people, pagans. And we are different. We are nothing like them, which is exactly why we'll wipe them all out, so that they will no longer be pagans." This was, of course, an extremely hypocritical position. But let's return to Montezuma. His envoys told the Spaniards the following: "Do not go further inland. Do not approach our capital, the city of Tenochtitlan. Otherwise, terrible divine punishment will fall upon you. We will meet you in war." Cortés, of course, did not care at all. He very quickly realized that many other tribes were dissatisfied with the Aztecs, which meant the Spaniards would have allies. Meanwhile, among the Spaniards themselves, an unexpected split formed. Part of the conquistadors believed that Cortés's actions went beyond the authority granted to him by the governor of Cuba. In their eyes, this was beginning to look like a rebellion. According to them, the goals of the expedition had already been achieved. Information about new lands and their inhabitants had been gathered. Check. Pagan idols had been toppled. Check. Plenty of loot had been collected. Check. It was time to return to Cuba. Cortés, of course, did not want to fight with his own men. He acted shrewdly but decisively. He proposed not to stop at reconnaissance, but to begin conquering territories and building new Spanish cities. At the same time, he ordered the ships to be run aground, their sails and cannons removed, so that no one would be tempted to escape. After this, Cortés marched toward the Aztec capital. In August 1519, the expedition set out from the newly founded city of Veracruz on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. 300 Spaniards and about 800 warriors from the Totonac tribe. Later, around 10,000 more fighters from other tribes joined Cortés. In October, Cortés entered the city of Cholula, the second largest city-state of Central America, home to no fewer than 100,000 people. There stood the largest pyramid in the Americas, 55 meters high. Cortés himself wrote that here, a plot had been devised against the conquistadors. The locals planned a surprise attack to slaughter all the Spaniards. Learning of this, Cortés carried out a brutal massacre that lasted 2 days. The Spaniards not only killed the inhabitants, but also looted the city. According to contemporaries, the total number of victims of Cortés's massacre was around 6,000 people. Cortés himself later recalled the event reluctantly, but one way or another, he had demonstrated to Montezuma both his power and his willingness to go all the way. On November 8, 1519, the Spaniards entered the capital without resistance. The city's residents looked in fear at these horsemen in armor, the infantry with their swords drawn, and the 1,000 native allies dragging cannons behind them. But the astonishment was mutual. Bernal Diaz, a participant in the expedition, wrote in his diary, "The crowding was unbelievable. From the streets, rooftops, balconies, and boats, 1,000 eyes pierced into us. Our insignificance grew ever more apparent." At that time, the city may have had a population of at least 200,000, with some estimates going much higher, possibly approaching 1 million, making it one of the largest cities on the planet. The capital was crossed with canals, along which great canoes floated. The Spaniards compared the city to Venice, only far larger and far richer. When they met, Chief Montezuma showed hospitality and generosity. He presented Cortés with gold ornaments, and at first, the Spaniards behaved almost like ordinary tourists. They walked around the city, marveled at the pyramids, admired the beauty of the women, and were dazzled by the abundance of gold. They lived in the palace of a former ruler, surrounded by respect that was, of course, driven by fear. This idyll didn't last long, however, because Cortés soon received troubling news from Veracruz. The Aztecs had attacked the garrison and inflicted heavy losses on the Spaniards. Cortés then undertook his boldest gamble. He demanded an audience with Montezuma, accused the emperor of treachery, and took him hostage in his own palace. Surprisingly, the Aztecs offered no resistance, and thus a state of uneasy half-peace, half-war persisted for the next 6 months. But then Cortés had to leave the capital to secure his status as ruler of the new territories. He ordered his officer, Pedro de Alvarado, to remain behind with 80 soldiers to keep watch and guard Montezuma. In hindsight, this turned out to be the worst decision of the entire expedition. In Cortés's absence, tension boiled over. During an Aztec religious festival, a bloody clash erupted. Later, each side gave its own version of events. The Spaniards claimed they had been trying to prevent a ritual sacrifice, while the Aztecs accused them of attempting to rob the participants. Either way, the result was a massacre in which around 400 Aztecs were killed. This sparked an explosion of unrest, and the Aztecs began preparing for war. By the time Cortés returned to the city, Montezuma had lost all authority over his subjects. On June 30th, 1520, as he attempted to calm his people, he was killed, though it remains unknown whether by his own people or by the Spaniards. The following night entered Mexican history as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrow. Cortés and his men attempted to retreat, but the Aztecs fell upon them in overwhelming numbers. More than 900 conquistadors and a vast number of their allies perished, and most importantly, all the gold they had plundered was lost. Cortés was left with only 450 soldiers. To make matters worse, political intrigue brewed in the rear. The governor of Cuba, Velázquez, who had never authorized Cortés's campaign against the Aztec capital, began plotting to strip him of all authority and denounce him as a traitor to the king. At that moment, it seemed clear the plan to conquer a mighty empire with a small force had failed completely. But two factors played into Cortés's hands. The first was his sheer determination and iron will. The second was smallpox, brought to Mexico by Spanish sailors. The disease swept through entire villages, killing thousands in the capital as well, including prominent warriors and leaders. Smallpox quickly carried off Montezuma's successor, who ruled for only 80 days. Meanwhile, Cortés pacified rebellious regions, built a fleet of brigantines, and by late spring 1521, he was ready to strike again at the Aztec capital. The assault began on May 30th of that year. 3 times the Spaniards reached the central districts of the city, and 3 times they were driven back. Losing men, Cortés shifted strategy. He placed the city under siege and bombarded it with cannons. Hunger soon gripped the defenders, and on August 13th, the young Emperor Cuauhtémoc tried to negotiate surrender, but to no avail. Shortly afterward, Tenochtitlan was utterly destroyed, and with it, the Aztec Empire ceased to exist. News from the New World traveled slowly, and in any case, Emperor Charles was hardly interested in events in Mexico. He had far more pressing concerns: urban uprisings in Castile, religious reformation in Germany, and his duties as Holy Roman Emperor. To add to the setback, a shipment of gold seized in the Aztec capital was intercepted by French pirates. At that point, the Spaniards remembered the treasure lost during La Noche Triste. Cortés ordered Cuauhtémoc and other Aztec nobles tortured, convinced they would reveal where the gold was hidden, but the mystery of the treasure remained unsolved. Meanwhile, the Cuban governor's intrigues came to nothing. In October 1522, Charles V signed a decree appointing Hernán Cortés as governor, captain general, and chief justice of New Spain, making him practically the independent ruler of an enormous territory. Historians still debate whether he ever considered founding a separate state, but most agree he remained a royalist, conquering lands for the Spanish crown. Yet, as ruler with near absolute authority, he naturally reserved for himself the right to distribute land. Only those who had personally participated in the conquest were eligible. Cortés also imposed quotas for agricultural production, both for imported crops such as grapes and wheat, and for local staples like maize, tomatoes, and peppers. In addition, he implemented a policy of segregation that would later be adopted in other colonies. Spaniards could reside only in cities, and in Mexico City, specific quarters were set aside exclusively for Spanish settlers. Living outside these designated zones was forbidden. The purpose was purely political. Cortés wanted to prevent the rise of uncontrolled, wild colonies beyond his reach, and one of his primary objectives was to convert the native population to Christianity. His biography was fairly typical for that era. Unlike the noble and relatively well-educated Cortés, Pizarro was a bastard, the illegitimate son of a poor nobleman. In his youth, he tried his hand at many trades. He worked among peasants as a swineherd, later became a mercenary. At the start of the 16th century, Pizarro found himself in the New World, taking part in various campaigns of conquest, including the founding of Panama. That small colony in Central America became the starting point for Spain's further conquests in the south. It was from there, in the 1524 to 1528, that Pizarro and his companion, Diego de Almagro, set out in search of El Dorado. Moving along the Pacific coast, they stumbled upon yet another great empire, that of the Incas, on the territory of present-day Peru. In power and wealth, the Inca Empire rivaled that of the Aztecs. Remarkably, Pizarro organized this expedition at his own expense. The governor of Panama had no desire to support the reckless gamble of a semi-literate, low-born conquistador. Pizarro staked everything. Failure meant losing not only his fortune, but likely his life. In 1520, he barely scraped together 160 men and set sail on 2 ships. Out of that voyage came a famous legend. When the crew, desperate from hunger and endless searching, was ready to mutiny, Pizarro drew a line in the sand and declared, "On one side lies Peru, with its riches and glory. On the other, Panama and poverty. Choose. As for me, I am going to Peru." Only 13 men crossed the line with him. Not everyone's encounter with the Incas ended well. 2 of Pizarro's envoys were taken to the Inca ruler Atahualpa and sacrificed to the god Viracocha. Pizarro himself returned to Spain to report his successes. Charles V backed him, granting Pizarro a noble title, the rank of adelantado, and the lifelong governorship of Peru. His partner, Diego de Almagro, also received rewards, though far fewer, an imbalance that would later spark bitter conflict between them. For now, though, it was early 1531. Pizarro, with 3 ships and 180 men, set out from Panama to conquer the Inca Empire. Along the way, he won over local tribes resentful of Inca rule. The Spaniards arrived in Peru at a lucky moment. The empire was torn apart by civil war, and the Incas were distracted by a struggle for the throne. The appearance of 180 foreigners caused little concern. On the map, standing at the edge of an empire stretching from Peru to Argentina, these men hardly looked like a threat. Yet Pizarro acted in much the same manner as Cortés years before. Surrounded by thousands of enemies, their survival depended on 2 things: iron discipline and the sympathy of the locals. All the gold and silver they seized was immediately melted into bars and sent to Panama, so as to avoid quarrels over the loot. 6 months after their landing, the Spaniards reached the city of Cajamarca. Here came the decisive moment of the expedition. By then, Pizarro commanded only 170 men. At the same time, the army of the Inca ruler Atahualpa numbered at least 45,000 warriors. Clearly, the arithmetic was not in Spain's favor. So Pizarro resorted to cunning. First, he invited the Inca emperor to a parley, hoping to intimidate him with simple tricks, brandishing a pistol, firing a cannon, showing off horses. But Atahualpa remained calm, even ordering the execution of followers who had shown fear of the Spanish weapons. The showdown came on November 16th, 1532. Atahualpa entered Cajamarca with 7,000 men. Suddenly, the Spaniards sprang from ambush. Armored in steel and mounted on horses, they crashed into warriors who carried only clubs and spears and wore no armor. Though the Incas vastly outnumbered them, they could offer almost no resistance. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre lasting 2 hours. The Inca emperor was taken prisoner. 5,000 of his warriors were killed. Pizarro did not lose a single soldier. Historians agree that this one battle allowed the conquistadors to subjugate an empire of 6 to 10 million people and to capture its sovereign. Nowhere else in history, before or since, has there been such an astonishing victory. In the Inca palace, the Spaniards discovered an impressive treasure: 80,000 gold pesos, 7,000 marks of silver, and precious stones. Seeing their excitement, Atahualpa made the legendary offer of ransom for his freedom. He promised Pizarro he would fill the very room in which he was imprisoned with gold and jewels. That room is said to have survived to this day, 35 square meters in area and 2.5 meters high. Pizarro agreed. For 6 months, the Inca gathered treasures, and the Spaniards began to suspect a trick. But in May 1533, the ransom was finally delivered, and they set about melting it down into bars. In the end, the conquistadors collected the staggering sum of 1,260,000 gold pesos and 52,000 marks of silver, equivalent to 6 tons of gold, worth roughly $500 million in today's terms. These Spanish mercenaries, once landless and uneducated but hardened with steel resolve, plundered a nation on a scale unimaginable. Pizarro kept about 60,000 pesos for himself, instantly becoming not just one of the richest men in Spain, but in all of Europe. Interestingly, this sudden flood of wealth changed the lives of ordinary soldiers. The value of gold plummeted in their eyes. Money became so abundant, they practically stopped counting it. Pizarro, however, was not content to stop. He set out for the empire's capital, Cusco. At this point, he made one of the cruelest decisions of his career. Despite receiving the ransom, he refused to release the Inca emperor. Instead, he resolved to execute him. Atahualpa was accused of the standard list of charges: usurpation, human sacrifice, paganism, and rebellion. Against whom, exactly? A hastily convened tribunal sentenced him to death. He was to be burned alive, a horror to the Incas, who believed in the immortality of the soul and reincarnation. To escape this fate, Atahualpa agreed to be baptized, and Pizarro kept his word. On July 26, 1533, the Inca emperor was publicly executed by garrote in the central square of Cajamarca. Legend has it that before his death he cursed the Spaniards. Indeed, most members of the expedition later perished from hunger, disease, Indian uprisings, or internecine conflict. Pizarro's expedition caused a sensation in Spain. New conquistadors rushed to Peru, while governors of the island colonies wrote anxiously to Emperor Charles. "No Spaniard will remain here unless we bind him in chains." In August 1533, the Spaniards marched on Cusco, accompanied by a new puppet emperor of the Incas, who seemed to serve only as a shield for the invaders crossing hostile territory. He soon died, perhaps poisoned. In any case, for the next 40 years, the Spaniards maintained puppet rulers until their authority in Peru was firmly entrenched. On November 15, 1533, Pizarro entered Cusco without resistance. Eyewitnesses described it as the greatest and most magnificent of all cities we had ever seen in the Indies. Adorned with so many splendid buildings that even in Spain it would have stood out above the rest. At its height, Cusco had 200,000 inhabitants, making it comparable in size to London or Paris. The Conquistadors compelled the city's residents to swear allegiance to Charles V and seized vast riches. They sent the emperor priceless gifts, including statues made of 30 kilograms of pure gold. It is astonishing that civilizations capable of building such pyramids and cities, knowledgeable in medicine, astrology, and astronomy, never developed effective weapons, and thus were toppled by a handful of vagabonds who scarcely broke a sweat. With Peru subdued, the Spaniards turned their ambitions north and south toward Ecuador and Chile. In Ecuador, one of Pizarro's lieutenants encountered Pedro de Alvarado, the friend of Cortés and conqueror of Guatemala. Both parties were searching for the mythical El Dorado and nearly came to blows with one another. Meanwhile, more and more colonists poured into Peru. Transporting them to the highland city of Cusco proved difficult. So on January 18, 1535, on the Pacific coast, Pizarro founded a new capital, Lima. This city would become the center of Spanish power in South America. Thus, the former swineherd and mercenary was made a marquis by Charles V. Pizarro seemed to have reached the pinnacle of power, ruling over an immense country. But not all the Incas accepted the loss of their empire. The supreme leader at the time, Manco Inca Yupanqui, decided to rise in revolt in late 1535. Supported by the native nobility, he gathered a massive army, tens of thousands strong, and surrounded Cusco. Inside the city stood a Spanish garrison of just 190 men, including 80 horsemen, along with several thousand Indian allies from rival tribes. The Spaniards occupied a fortified citadel and made daring sorties to terrify their enemies, committing brutal atrocities, such as slaughtering captured women. The siege dragged on for 10 months. In the end, Manco realized Cusco could not be taken, especially once reinforcements arrived for the Spaniards. The Incas lifted the siege and retreated into the Andean highlands, where their rump state would survive until the 1570s. Gradually, the empire of the Incas was erased from the face of the earth. What was happening in Peru? At one point, a literal civil war broke out among the Spaniards themselves. Diego de Almagro tried to take advantage of the Inca uprising and seize Cusco for himself, but he was defeated in a decisive battle and sent to the gallows. 3 years later, in 1538, Almagro's son organized a conspiracy against Francisco Pizarro. 12 armed conspirators stormed the house of the now aged conquistador. Pizarro met his attackers with a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other. He fought bravely, wounded several assailants, but in the end he was cut down. With his death, however, the conquest of South America did not end. Just before, in 1535, Charles V had sent a new expedition to South America under the command of Pedro de Mendoza. Mendoza's ships reached what is now Argentina, where the conquistadors founded several settlements, among them the future Buenos Aires and Asunción, the future capital of Paraguay. But under relentless pressure from the indigenous peoples, the Spaniards had to retreat, board their ships, and sail back home. Mendoza died at sea, and those lands reverted to the Spanish crown, only to be retaken 40 years later. Back then, Colombia wasn't called that. It was known as New Granada. The first to explore its coastline was the Italian Amerigo Vespucci in 1499. A few years later, Columbus himself sailed past during his last voyage to the New World. Spaniards came here chasing the same dream of El Dorado. But for a long time, the local tribes repelled their attempts to push inland. Only in the 1530s did a few expeditions manage to penetrate beyond the coast. One of them, led by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, spent 8 brutal months hacking through tropical jungle, fighting native groups again and again. In August 1538, his persistence was rewarded. He discovered the thriving kingdom of the Chibcha people. In a scenic valley, on the site of their settlement of Bacatá, he founded the city of Santa Fe de Bogotá, which would later become the capital of Colombia. To the Spaniards' great disappointment, they found no vast reserves of gold there, but they did uncover significant treasure. About 200,000 pesos in pure gold and nearly 2,000 emeralds. To this day, Colombia is rich in emeralds. The Chibcha had a unique custom. Their tribal chief would be covered in clay and sprinkled with gold dust until he appeared as a golden man. He would then bathe in a sacred lake, washing the gold from his body. In Spanish, golden man was rendered as El Hombre Dorado. This ritual is believed to be the origin of the legend of El Dorado. The Spaniards knew of the custom and suspected the Chibcha had hidden most of their treasures in that sacred lake. Eventually, they located it, the Lake Guatavita in the Colombian mountains. Attempts to drain it or reach the bottom all failed. In the years that followed, Quesada and his comrades expanded their holdings. The conquered territory was named the New Kingdom of Granada, encompassing what are today Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, and Ecuador. And all of it began with a rumor about a golden man's ritual. It's amazing Pablo Escobar never thought of reviving it. He could easily have afforded to sponsor such ceremonies daily in the 20th century. But that's another story. If you haven't seen our episode on Escobar, check it out. Another key figure in the story of the conquest was Hernando de Soto, one of Pizarro's most active lieutenants in Peru. De Soto later made several important discoveries in North America. In May 1539, he landed on the coast of Florida with 600 soldiers in search of gold. At the time, settlers in the New World were captivated by the legend of the 7 cities, supposedly located somewhere in the north and filled with fabulous riches. The conquistadors marched to find them. Almost immediately they clashed with local tribes. After a series of fierce battles, the Spaniards had lost 2/3 of their force. But De Soto and his men did not give up. They pushed on through the lands of modern Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, becoming the first Europeans to reach the banks of the continent's greatest river, the Mississippi. The expedition kept moving farther west, hoping to reach the Pacific coast, but they had no real sense of how far away it was. They found no gold, and the march grew harder and harder. In May 1542, De Soto died of fever, and the remnants of his party struggled back to Mexico a year later, empty-handed. Yet this disastrous adventure had one unexpected legacy. Along the way, several dozen Spanish horses escaped, seeding the North American population of the Mustangs that would later roam the continent and become one of its enduring symbols. As a result of all these conquests, Spain gained an enormous dominion across 2 continents in just 50 years. The total area of its new possessions was about 10 million square kilometers, compared to only 500,000 for Spain itself, and all of it was won by fewer than 10,000 conquistadors in total. The era of conquest opened unbelievable opportunities for impoverished nobles and rootless adventurers. Truly, those who had been nothing became everything. These men enriched themselves, won noble titles, and became part of the new Spanish elite ruling the American continent. But the age of the conquistadors was drawing to a close. Most of them died in their struggles for power and gold. Governing the colonies became the work of politicians, administrators, and bureaucrats. That is why the famous Hernán Cortés ended his days quietly in Spain, never returning to Mexico. Conquistadors became central figures in the so-called Black Legend of Spain. Francisco Franco later ordered all books on the Black Legend destroyed, replacing them with a White Legend that glorified Spain's actions. But Spain's opponents accused the conquistadors of savage cruelty and insatiable greed. And frankly, the critics weren't far from the truth, as you can judge for yourself. By some estimates, after the Spanish invasions, populations in parts of the Americas declined by up to 90%. And here's the irony. The stolen gold brought little lasting benefit, neither to the soldiers nor to Spain itself. Over 150 years, the Spaniards plundered more than half of all the gold that existed in Europe at the time. The 16th century is rightly called Spain's Golden Age, but the flood of wealth produced a boom, followed by collapse. Massive inflows of American gold wrecked its value on European markets, fueling runaway inflation. Much of the treasure was squandered on Spain's endless wars. At home, the workforce shrank, as thousands of able-bodied men rushed to the New World to plunder. Meanwhile, England and other nations built industries, while Spain remained hooked on its golden needle, trading bullion for luxuries, tapestries, and paintings. In time, Spain's one great advantage, naval supremacy, eroded as England and France began to prey on its treasure fleets. The mighty empire, inflated by stolen wealth, collapsed like a castle built on sand. And in this sense, perhaps the curse of Montezuma really did come true. Thank you for watching this history lesson. Until next time.